Welcome back to C++ Fundamentals. Let's take a little bit of time here to talk about scope of names. Scope. Scope determines the lifetime of a name, how long something is visible and usable. So scope also determines the visibility of a name, when something is created, when it's then released from memory, and so on. Scope also says when constructors and destructors of a class are called. When a class comes into scope and is instantiated, then the constructor is called to create the items within the class that are to be constructed. And when the scope of the class ends, when the class goes out of scope, the destructors are called, which perform cleanup. And the scope operator for classes and namespaces is 2 colons, : and that is used to resolve scope issues if it's not obvious, if it's not an implied local scope. If you have to specify the class or the namespace scope, you use those 2 colons. Statement blocks are the 2 braces, top and bottom brace, open and closed brace that you see there. A local scope only occurs within the braces. So that integer I that you see there is never accessible by anything around it because nothing happens within those blocks. It comes into scope as we come into the brace, and then when we leave the closing brace, it goes away and it's done. It's a local automatic. It's created on the stack quickly and then just as quickly thrown away. So local scope is great for having little counters in for loops, while loops, small test values, things like that are very local, but do not hang around in the program for very long. Local scope. Function scope. The only thing that really has function scope is a label. And there we have our little foo function and an integer I and a character C and then a label. There's a label and it has a colon at the end of it. That's how we know it's a label. And then there's going to be more code under there. That label is only accessible by code within that foo function, within the open and closed braces. That label is not visible anyplace else outside that function. That is called function scope. File scope is for names that are declared outside the braces. They have the scope of the translation unit, and sometimes that's called a global. There you see we have an integer x declared outside of foo, and it could be used by foo or any other function which is in the translation unit along with that foo function. Because it is not declared within the function, it is outside, so it has file scope throughout the translation unit. If you want it to have linkage, whole different animal than scope. If you want it to have linkage in your other translation units, you call it out by saying extern int x, which is your declaration that says this integer x is defined someplace else. And over here is where we're defining it in this translation unit. And we know that we can only define it once. We just talked about that. This also has namespace scope. When we define namespaces, or when we have a translation unit without a defined namespace in C++, that is in fact still the namespace of the translation unit. So sometimes you'll see this referred to as namespace scope, even though we have not created an explicit new namespace here. And then this is class scope. Names that are declared within a class are local to the class. So here we have a class called cfoo. Use the uppercase C to denote that this is a class, not a function. And we have our integer I and character C and more code down below there. Here we're going to make a new class object. We're going to make the type is cfoo. That's our class. And we're going to make a cfoo class object. All right, so there we go. That's a new thing that takes up memory. It has an integer and a character in it. But the only way we can get to this integer is by using the dot operator. A cfoo class object dot I equals something. That's the only way to get to this integer, by going through the proper scope definition. So that is class scope, because that is local to that class. All right, so that's the various kinds of scope that we have in C++.